Lesson planning, learning outcomes. In this video, you'll get an explanation of learning outcomes and examples.
Now that you understand the basics of a lesson plan and you have an idea of what we're going to need for our Louisiana Tech lesson plan submissions and how you'll be graded on them using our rubric when you're actually out in the field, let's break down some of the components that you'll find in the lesson plan. I'm going to start with learning outcomes. We've already talked about this a little bit when we were looking at the lesson plan directions and the template, but I want to delve into it a little more so that you have a better understanding. And I do want to say this caveat. This is your introduction in this class for a lot of students to lesson planning and some of these ideas behind it, like learning outcomes, teaching strategies, etc. I am doing the briefest of overviews. You will have much better and more extensive overviews in your later classes that are specific for education. So let's jump into this. Definition of a learning outcome. This is a specific statement that describes the significant and essential learning that learners will have to achieve within the context of your lesson, and it can be reliably demonstrated at the end of the course or program. So remember, we were talking about how your learning outcomes must be accessible within the context of your specific lesson. Here's where that comes in. So it's your significant and essential learning, and it can be reliably demonstrated, which means it can be assessed. So learning outcomes identify what the learner will know and be able to do by the end of your course or program, or by the end of your lesson, or by the end of your unit, depending on how you're writing them. It includes an outcome statement that tells the knowledge within a performance demonstration. So it actually explains what a student would have to demonstrate in order to prove that they're meeting that learning outcome. So that's the actual outcome statement. And then the performance statement kind of tells you what level that would be on. So the first section is what's the knowledge, and the second section is how would it be measured and what is considered acceptable. So learning outcomes refer to things that are observable and measurable only. You can observe and measure skills, knowledge, and attitudes. What should they include? They should reflect broad knowledge about the content or reflect essential knowledge, skills, or attitudes that the student should be able to demonstrate. So it's either broad conceptual knowledge or something more specific. It should concentrate on the results of the learning experience, because remember, your learning outcomes help dictate what you'll learn within the context of that lesson. So it is not a means or an end of the process of learning. It's just, it reflects what is desired at the end of the lesson. It doesn't mean that the learning stops there or that there are not other components, but it's the minimum performance that must be achieved for your students to prove that they have mastered that content or that skill. And it answers the question, why should a student complete this lesson, course, or program? And the learning outcome tells them, because you will learn this and you will have this sort of proficiency level. So learning outcomes may be considered to be expected behaviors that your students would demonstrate at the end of the lesson and that you would be able to assess. They can be broken down into three main components. Your action word, it's always an action verb. The action word is an action verb. It identifies the performance to be demonstrated. The learning statement actually specifies what learning will be demonstrated. And then your criteria defines what's the standard of performance that you accept and that you expect your learners to be able to demonstrate. So you have an action verb, a learning statement, I guess I'm backwards, an action verb, a learning statement that outlines what they're actually going to be demonstrating, and then a criteria for how you'll be able to measure if they actually did have that learning and if they did demonstrate it effectively within your assessment. So here are some verbs to include. You can Google action verbs or learning outcome verbs if you like, but here are some, and keep in mind, these are measurable and you can demonstrate them. Teachers can actually observe them and they can measure them. So the learner will use, the learner will develop, the learner will write, the learner will incorporate, the learner will construct. So that's your first part, your action word. Here are some you need to avoid because you cannot measure these. Appreciate. There's no way to actually quantifiably measure someone's appreciation. Oh, you've got an 85% appreciation of this. That's it's not quantifiable and it's too vague. Realize, be aware of, perceive. The learner will perceive X, Y, and Z. That's not measurable. Keep in mind, those action words, those verbs must be measurable. So here's some examples. The learner will, TLW, read and comprehend the nun's portion of the prologue of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So you can actually develop an assessment where you're measuring if students actually comprehend, and if they comprehend, then they read the text. So that's a demonstration of reading, and then your assessment measures their actual comprehension, and then you'll have a cutoff score. Say a C, the lowest C, that they have to demonstrate. They have to get so many questions correct or get so much of the narrative correct to demonstrate that they did read and comprehend the nun's portion of the prologue of Canterbury Tales. The learner will identify and use scientific processes and the scientific method as used by geologists. So you can actually give your students a lesson where they have to use the scientific process and the scientific methods and work through a problem that a geologist would work through concerning rocks or other formations like that. Number 5 is a simple one for very young kids. The learner will count money and calculate change. You can easily assess that. And as you'll see on a slide, I think in a second, a lot of times these demonstrations of learning, they don't have to be big quizzes. They don't have to be big tests, anything like that. It could just be informal checks for understanding or an exit ticket. It is only as complicated as you want it to be or as you need it to be, depending on your content and your grade level. And if we were in the classroom, I'd be using Pear Deck and get y'all to write a sample learning outcome, but you're not here. So as always, let me know what questions you have.